Dakota Territory, October 1886, while her neighbors rushed to lay in barrels of salt pork and mend the gaps in their sod roofs. Elspeth Wren embarked on a project that made absolutely no sense whatsoever to anyone who happened to ride past her homestead. The 44-year-old widow, whose husband had died of pneumonia 2 winters prior, began hauling cordwood not to her woodshed, not to a covered lean-to, but directly against the exterior walls of her modest log cabin. Stack after stack, rising higher with each passing day, until the split pine and oak began to swallow the cabin whole. Not one stack, not two. Elspeth built a fortress of firewood, wrapping her home in a continuous rampart of split logs that climbed from the frozen earth up past the window sills, then higher still, until only the peaked roof and the black iron chimney remained visible above the timber. Each log was placed with deliberate care, bark side out, ends aligned, gaps packed with smaller kindling and scraps of birch. "She's lost her wits since Thomas passed," muttered a neighbor woman, watching Elspeth heft another armload of oak against the north wall. "The grief has finally taken her." In October, with the first hard frost already whitening the prairie grass, what they failed to understand, what remained invisible to their eyes, was that Elspeth Wren wasn't hoarding firewood in some deranged act of mourning. She was constructing a thermal barrier that would outlast, outperform, and ultimately outlive every conventional structure within the settlement of Redstone Crossing. But first, she had to endure their pity, their whispers, and eventually their scorn. If you want to discover the survival principle that turned a widow's supposed madness into the salvation of an entire town, the exact same technique that modern preppers and off-grid homesteaders are only now rediscovering, then press that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share isn't just a forgotten frontier story. It's a masterclass in cold weather engineering that our great-great-grandmothers understood instinctively, and which the modern world has been arrogant enough to forget. And I promise you this, by the time this story reaches its final chapter, you will never look at a woodpile the same way again. Elspeth Wren had come to Dakota Territory in 1879 with her husband Thomas, a wiry Welshman who dreamed of raising cattle where the land was still cheap and the horizon still open. For 7 years, they had built a life together on that quarter section, breaking sod, digging a well by hand, raising a modest herd of longhorns, and constructing the cabin that Elspeth now surrounded with wood. Thomas had been the dreamer. Elspeth had been the one who read every farming almanac, every homestead manual, and every letter their families sent from the old country describing how the crofters of Wales endured winters when the sea winds tore the thatch from the roofs. When Thomas died in the winter of 1884, coughing blood into a linen handkerchief as Elspeth held his hand, the community of Redstone Crossing expected her to sell the claim and return east. Widows did not hold land alone in Dakota Territory. Widows did not break their own sod, chop their own wood, or face the prairie blizzards without a man's shoulder to lean upon. But Elspeth Wren had not been a woman who broke easily, and she was not about to abandon the 7 years of labor that lay buried in that soil alongside her husband. She stayed. She ran the herd down to a manageable size, sold what she could not tend, and settled into the rhythm of solitary homesteading. And she began to observe. She watched how the wind cut across the open prairie in January, unimpeded by trees or hills. She watched how her cabin, well-built though it was, bled heat through every seam and chink no matter how carefully she stuffed the gaps with rags and mud. She watched her woodpile shrink at an alarming rate, and she calculated, night after night by the flickering light of her oil lamp, how many cords she would burn if she did nothing differently. The numbers frightened her, so Elspeth Wren decided to do something differently. The idea had come to her in fragments over the summer of 1886, pieced together from 3 separate memories that had been drifting through her mind for years. The first was a letter her grandmother had sent from a Welsh mining village decades earlier, describing how the cottagers there banked peat and turf against their outer walls each autumn, sealing their homes inside a breathing skin of organic matter that held the warmth of the hearth like a closed fist. The second was a story Thomas had once told her about Norwegian settlers in Minnesota who packed snow against the north walls of their sod houses, using the snow itself as insulation once temperatures dropped below freezing. And the third was something she had observed with her own eyes just the previous winter. That January, during a stretch of 40 below cold, Elspeth had noticed that the section of her cabin's north wall behind which she had stacked a partial cord of firewood, meaning to move it to the shed but never quite finding the time, was noticeably warmer to the touch on the inside than the rest of the wall. She had pressed her palm against the logs one bitter morning and felt the difference so distinctly that she had marked it in her diary. At the time, she had dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of the drafts, but by the summer of 1886 she had come to understand that it was no trick at all. It was physics, plain and undeniable, waiting to be applied. She spent June and July felling and splitting wood, not just enough for burning but 3 times that amount. She worked from before dawn until the light failed, her hands blistering and then hardening into the calloused instruments of a woman who no longer had anyone to spare her the labor. Her closest neighbor, a stout German widower named Otto Bergmann, rode over one July afternoon and found her stacking split oak 6 feet high beside her barn. "Frau Wren," he said carefully, removing his hat, "you are cutting wood like you plan to burn the whole prairie. There is no need for so much. One woman alone, one small cabin, 4 cords will see you through." Elspeth wiped the sweat from her brow with her forearm and looked at him steadily. "I'm not burning it, Otto, I'm building with it." He blinked. He did not understand. Few people would have. But Otto Bergmann was a courteous man and he did not press her. He tipped his hat, wished her a productive afternoon, and rode back to his own place carrying the puzzled expression of a man who has just witnessed something he cannot quite classify. By evening he had told his sister-in-law, and by the following Sunday, half the congregation at the small Lutheran meeting house in Redstone Crossing knew that the Wren widow was chopping enough wood to heat a governor's mansion and had begun, most peculiarly, to stack it against the outside of her cabin. The talk started gently. A widow's eccentricity, they called it, grief taking strange forms. Reverend Hollies, a kindly man who had buried Thomas Wren 2 winters back, made a special trip out to her homestead in early September to inquire after her well-being. He arrived to find Elspeth up on a small scaffold she had built herself, carefully placing split oak against the south wall of her cabin, working the pieces in like a stonemason fitting ashlar. "Mrs. Wren," he called up to her, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, "the community is concerned. Some of us have wondered if perhaps the strain of managing this place alone has grown too heavy. There would be no shame in accepting help. My wife and I have space in the parsonage through the winter, if you would consider." Elspeth climbed down from her scaffold slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a small woman, barely 5'3", with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes the color of cold slate. She looked at Reverend Hollies with an expression that was neither offended nor grateful, merely patient, the way a schoolteacher looks at a child who has misread a simple word. "Reverend," she said, "when the blizzards come this winter, and they will come harder than they have in 20 years, I want you to remember 2 things. The first is that you offered me kindness, and I am grateful for it. The second is that I refused it because I did not need it." Reverend Hollies rode back to Redstone Crossing that evening carrying a heavier heart than when he had arrived. He had expected to find a woman worn thin by grief and solitude. Instead, he had found something he could not name, a certainty in Elspeth Wren's voice that bordered on prophecy, and a wall of split oak rising toward her cabin's eaves with a precision that spoke not of madness, but of intention. He told his wife over supper that night that he was not sure what Mrs. Wren was doing, but he was quite sure she knew exactly what it was. The rest of the settlement did not share his uncertainty. By mid-September, Elspeth Wren had become the topic of every kitchen conversation and every general store transaction in Redstone Crossing. Cassius Merriweather, who ran the mercantile and considered himself the most educated man in the district, by virtue of having completed 2 years at a St. Louis normal school, offered his diagnosis with the confidence of a man who had never once been contradicted by reality. "It is a well-documented phenomenon," Cassius declared to a knot of farmers gathered around his pot-bellied stove one crisp afternoon. "Grief in the isolated female mind. She lost Thomas, and now she is building a symbolic tomb around herself. The wood is the coffin. Mark my words, by Christmas she will have stopped eating, and by February we will find her frozen at her own hearth, surrounded by the very fuel that could have saved her." The men nodded. It was a compelling diagnosis. It had the ring of educated authority, and it gave them a framework for understanding something that otherwise resisted understanding. Elspeth Wren, in their minds, ceased to be a competent widow making rational choices, and became instead a tragic figure requiring intervention. The one voice of dissent came from an unexpected quarter. Old Silas Kettleman, a former trapper who had spent 40 years in the Northern Territories before settling in Redstone Crossing to raise chickens and irritate the Reverend with his salty opinions, listened to Cassius Merriweather hold forth, and then spat a stream of tobacco juice into the sand bucket beside the stove. "Boy," he said, addressing the storekeeper who was 52 years old, "you ain't never seen a proper winter, and you sure as sin ain't never seen a Welsh crofter's cottage. That woman ain't burying herself. That woman is doing what her people done since before your grandmother's grandmother was a notion. She's building a coat for her house." Cassius laughed indulgently. "A coat, Silas." "For a house? You laugh now," Silas replied, rising stiffly from his chair and reaching for his cane. "You laugh right up until January. Then you come find me and we'll see who's laughing. I'd wager my last chicken that woman burns half the wood you do this winter and stays twice as warm doing it." The men chuckled at the old trapper's stubbornness as he shuffled out of the store. Silas Kettleman was known for his contrarian streak, and no one placed much weight on his pronouncements. But his words stayed with Reverend Hollies, who happened to be present that afternoon purchasing flour, and the Reverend rode home turning the phrase over in his mind. A coat for her house. It was such a simple image, and yet it opened onto something larger, something he could not quite grasp but felt certain lay just beyond the horizon of his understanding. Meanwhile, out at her homestead, Elspeth Wren continued her work. By the last week of September, the woodpile against her south wall had risen to a height of 9 feet. She had transitioned now to the east wall, working with the same methodical patience, choosing pieces by size and shape, fitting them together with the tightness of a puzzle. She left the entrance to her cabin clear, of course, a narrow passage flanked by the growing walls of wood. She left the window on the south side accessible, though she had already sewn heavy quilted curtains to hang over it once the cold came, and she left the chimney's path unobstructed, calculating the angle of prevailing wind and adjusting her stack accordingly. She worked alone. She had refused every offer of help, and there had been several, most of them well-intentioned attempts to redirect her supposed madness into more conventional preparations. Otto Bergman had offered to trade her firewood hauling labor for help with her hay. She had declined, politely but firmly. What Elspeth Wren understood, and what her critics failed to grasp, was that a cabin loses heat not primarily through its ceiling or its floor, but through the enormous surface area of its exposed walls, and that the greatest thief of warmth in a Dakota winter was not the cold itself but the wind. On the open prairie, where nothing broke the horizon for miles in any direction, the January gales did not merely chill a structure. They stripped it. They drove frigid air through every seam, every knot hole, every gap in the chinking, and they carried away heat by the simple mechanism of forced convection at a rate no interior fire could hope to match. A log cabin, no matter how well constructed, is essentially a hollow box of dead wood standing exposed to whatever the sky chooses to hurl at it. The logs themselves have some insulating value. Wood is a poor conductor of heat, which is why the men of Redstone Crossing believed, quite reasonably, that a thick log wall was as good a barrier as any homesteader could ask for. But wood alone cannot defeat the wind, and wood alone cannot compensate for the temperature gradient that develops when it is 30 below outside and 60 above inside. Heat moves from warm to cold with a relentlessness that no amount of hope can slow. Elspeth had understood, in the practical way that women who have kept house through hard winters always understand, that if she could reduce that temperature gradient at the outer surface of her walls, she could dramatically reduce the rate at which her cabin lost heat. She could not warm the outdoors, but she could create an intermediate layer, a buffer zone, in which the temperature would sit somewhere between the killing cold of the open air and the modest warmth of her interior. And she had recognized that a thick wall of stacked firewood was precisely that buffer. The physics were elegant, though Elspeth would not have used the word. Firewood, especially split firewood stacked with bark side out and end grain exposed, contains an enormous quantity of trapped air. Every gap between logs, every fissure in the split face, every crevice where two irregular pieces meet is a pocket of still air. Still air is one of the finest insulators known to nature, which is why birds fluff their feathers in the cold, and why a wool sweater warms not because the wool itself is hot, but because the fibers trap air against the skin. A 5-foot-thick wall of stacked cordwood is, in effect, a 5-foot-thick blanket of still air held in place by a matrix of dry timber. Furthermore, the wood itself has thermal properties that assist the effect. It absorbs a small amount of heat radiating outward from the cabin's log walls during the day and during firing hours, and it releases that heat slowly through the night, moderating the temperature swings at the interface between the outer log surface and the innermost stack of split wood. The result is that the cabin's actual walls, the load-bearing logs Thomas Wren had raised in 1879, never experienced the full brutal cold of the Dakota winter. They experience, instead, the temperature of the innermost layer of the woodpile, which even on the coldest nights would sit dramatically warmer than the exterior air. Elspeth had calculated, in her practical womanly way, and without the benefit of a single engineering textbook, that her stacked wood barrier would raise the effective temperature at her cabin's outer wall surface by 20 to 30 degrees. She did not use those precise numbers. She did not know the term thermal resistance, and she had never heard of an R value. But she knew, from her observation of that partial cord the previous winter, from her grandmother's letters, and from the accumulated intuition of a woman who had spent 7 years watching her home shed heat into the void, that the principle would work. She was as certain of it as she was of the position of the North Star. There was one additional benefit she had planned for, one that even Sila's kettleman with his 40 years of trapping had not fully appreciated. The wood was not merely insulation. It was also fuel. As she burned through the interior stack she kept in her woodshed for daily use, she would eventually begin drawing from the outer walls, working her way in from the top of each stack, harvesting from her own insulation. The barrier would shrink slowly across the winter, but only as the worst of the cold began to relent. By the second week of October, Elspeth Wren had completed her outer walls, and the sight of her cabin from a distance had become genuinely startling. What had been a modest single-story log home now appeared to be a squat pyramid of timber, its peaked roof rising from a broad base of split wood that swelled outward at ground level and tapered gently upward to meet the eaves. From half a mile away, a rider might have mistaken it for an enormous woodpile that had somehow grown a chimney. From closer in, the true structure revealed itself, but even then the effect was arresting. Elspeth's cabin looked less like a house and more like a creature that had wrapped itself in armor and settled down to wait. She was not finished, however. Once the walls were complete, she turned her attention to the details that would determine whether her design succeeded or failed. She sealed the top of each wood stack with a sloped cap of smaller split pieces and a layer of birch bark she had gathered over the summer, ensuring that snow and meltwater would run off rather than soak into the wood. She built a small covered vestibule at her door, framed from scrap lumber and roofed with tar paper she had traded 3 dozen eggs for at the mercantile, creating an airlock between the outside world and her main living space. and she cut a series of small ventilation channels through the wood stack at the base of her chimney's exterior path, ensuring that the draft would not be strangled. She also made one final preparation that no one in Redstone Crossing observed, because she made it inside her cabin, where no visitor had been invited since Thomas's death. She dismantled the sleeping alcove she and Thomas had shared and rebuilt it against the interior of the west wall, the wall now protected by the deepest section of her woodpile. She moved her cast iron stove from its original position along the north wall to a spot closer to the geometric center of the room, so that its heat would radiate outward in all directions rather than being lost to the wall directly behind it. And she laid a thick pallet of straw and wool blankets on the floor beside the stove, understanding that on the very worst nights she might choose to sleep there rather than in her bed, close to the source of warmth. By the third week of October, the first hard freeze arrived. The prairie grass whitened, the well handle stiffened in Elspeth's grip each morning, and the sky took on that particular slate-gray hardness that Dakota Territory reserved for its long approach into winter. In Redstone Crossing, the settlers made their final preparations. They banked their root cellars, they slaughtered their fall hogs, they cured their hams and packed their sausages, and they gathered around one another's kitchens in the evenings to speculate about the coming season, and inevitably, about Elspeth Wren. The wagering began at the Mercantile in early November. It was not conducted with cash, for cash was scarce in Redstone Crossing that year, but with promises of labor and goods. Cassius Merriweather, still confident in his diagnosis of terminal grief, wagered a barrel of cornmeal that Elspeth Wren would either abandon her homestead or die in it before the spring thaw. Otto Bergman, who felt privately that the widow was neither dying nor mad but could not quite explain what she was doing, wagered nothing, but let it be known that he intended to check on her regularly through the winter. A dry goods clerk named Percival Tate, who had strong opinions about most things despite being only 22 years old, wagered a pair of leather boots that Elspeth's woodpile would ignite from a stray ember and burn her cabin to the ground before January. Silas Kettleman, hearing this last wager, laughed so hard he had a coughing fit that lasted a full minute. When he recovered, he wiped his eyes and pointed a gnarled finger at young Tate. "Boy," he said, "green wood stacked tight don't burn from a chimney spark. Green wood stacked tight barely burns when you want it to. That woman knows more about how fire behaves than every man in this store put together, and I include myself in that count. You keep them boots. You're going to need them come February." The first true snow arrived on the 11th of November, a soft, steady fall that lasted through the night and left 6 inches on the ground by morning. It was not a blizzard, merely the opening curtain of the season, but it was enough to transform the landscape and to give the settlers of Redstone Crossing their first clear look at how Elspeth Wren's peculiar cabin would behave in winter conditions. Otto Bergman rode out to check on her the following afternoon, ostensibly to bring her a jar of his sister-in-law's preserved plums, and what he observed he reported that evening at the Mercantile in tones of unmistakable astonishment. The snow, he explained, had drifted against the outer walls of her woodpile in a way that immediately began to fill the gaps between the split logs. Wind-blown powder had packed itself into every crevice at the base of the stacks, and the snow that had fallen atop her caps and sloped roofs had settled into an even white blanket that covered the wood entirely on the north and west sides. What had been a woodpile the day before was now, in effect, a snow-covered mound, and the snow itself had become part of her insulation system. "She is wrapping her house twice," Otto said, shaking his head slowly. "Once with wood, and now the sky is wrapping her again with snow, and the wood holds the snow in place. It does not slide off like from a roof. It sits there. It stays." Cassius Merriweather snorted. "It stays until it melts, Otto, and then she has wet wood rotting against her walls. She has doomed that cabin. When the spring comes, if she survives to see it, she will find her logs mildewed and her foundations compromised." Silas Kettleman, seated as always by the stove, spoke without opening his eyes. Spring is a long way from November, Cassius, and rot needs warmth to grow. That wood will freeze solid by December and stay frozen till April. Won't be no rotting. The storekeeper did not reply. He was beginning, though he would not have admitted it aloud, to feel a small worm of doubt turning in his mind. He had watched Otto Bergmann's face as the German widower described what he had seen, and Otto was not a man given to exaggeration. Something at the Wren homestead was working differently than Cassius had predicted, and the difference was already visible in the first snowfall of the season. By the last week of November, the temperature had dropped into the single digits and stayed there. The prairie wind, unimpeded by any feature of the flat Dakota landscape, howled down from Canada with the unbroken fury of 1,000 miles of open country. In Redstone Crossing, families huddled around their stoves and hearths, wrapped themselves in every quilt they possessed, and began to work through their woodpiles at rates that surprised even the most experienced homesteaders. Cassius Merriweather noted with concern that his own consumption had already exceeded his estimates for December, and it was not yet December. Otto Bergmann rode out again on the last day of November, this time with the specific intention of measurement rather than mere observation. He had grown up in a small village in Bavaria, where his grandfather had kept detailed logs of firewood consumption across the winters of 6 decades, and Otto had inherited the old man's habit of numerical precision. He wanted to see, with his own eyes and by his own count, how much wood Elspeth Wren was burning. He arrived at mid-morning to find her chimney producing a thin, steady wisp of smoke, so slight that from a distance he had briefly wondered if her fire had gone out. He tied his horse to the small hitching post she had installed beside her vestibule and knocked at the outer door. Elspeth answered wearing a plain woolen dress, a knitted shawl and no shoes, only heavy stockings on her feet. She looked at him with mild surprise but not displeasure. "Otto, come in from the cold." He stepped into the vestibule, then through the inner door into her main room, and he stopped so abruptly that his boots squeaked on the floorboards. The room was warm. Not merely tolerable, not merely above freezing, but genuinely warm in the way that a well-tended parlor is warm on a Sunday afternoon. He could feel the heat on his face immediately, and he could see that Elspeth was dressed as a woman dresses indoors in summer. Otto Bergmann removed his heavy fur cap and unbuttoned his coat almost involuntarily. He had ridden 4 miles through a wind that stung his eyes and numbed his cheekbones, and he had expected to find Elspeth Wren shivering in a modestly warmed cabin, grateful for company and possibly hungry. Instead, he found a woman who appeared to be spending the winter as though it were early autumn, tending a modest fire in a stove that glowed with the steady warmth of well-controlled combustion, rather than the roaring desperation he had left behind at his own homestead that morning. "Frau Wren," he said, holding his cap in both hands, "may I ask, how often are you feeding this stove?" Elspeth smiled slightly. She had been expecting this question or one like it since the first snow had fallen. "I light it in the morning before I milk the goats. I feed it once at midday when I come in for dinner. I feed it once more before I go to sleep. 3 times in a day, Otto, that is all." Otto stared at her. He was feeding his own stove every 2 hours, sometimes more often when the wind was fierce, and even so his wife wore 2 shawls at the supper table and their youngest slept in a wool cap. And how much wood at each feeding? 4 pieces, perhaps 5 if the pieces are small. He did the arithmetic silently. 15 pieces of split wood in a day. He was burning easily 60, perhaps 70, and his cabin was no larger than hers. He set his cap on the table and looked around the room slowly, taking in details he had not noticed at first. The heavy quilted curtain drawn across the south window, the straw pallet arranged beside the stove, the interior surface of the west wall, which he could see clearly, showing no trace of the frost patterns that had begun to appear on his own walls 2 weeks earlier. He walked to that wall and pressed his palm against the logs, and he felt something that surprised him. The wall was not cold. It was cool in the way that a cellar wall is cool in summer, but it was not the biting cold of exterior lumber in a Dakota November. "Frau Wren," he said quietly. "I owe you an apology. I did not laugh at you, but I did not defend you either when others laughed. That was cowardice on my part." Elspeth waved this away with a small motion of her hand. "You brought me plums, Otto. That was not cowardice. Sit down. I have coffee, and I can spare a little sugar for a guest." They sat at her small pine table, and Otto Bergman accepted a tin cup of hot coffee, and he asked her the question he had come intending to ask. He asked her how she had known. Elspeth was quiet for a long moment, wrapping her fingers around her own cup. Then she began to speak, more openly than she had spoken to anyone in Redstone Crossing since Thomas had died. She told him about her grandmother's letters from Wales, about the turf-banked cottages of the mining villages. She told him about the partial cord of wood she had left against her north wall the previous winter, and the warmth she had felt on the interior of that wall on a 40-below morning. She told him about the arithmetic she had done by lamplight, calculating how many cords she would need if she did nothing differently, and comparing that figure to what she and Thomas together had cut in their best year. The numbers had not balanced. Without a change, she would either exhaust her woodpile by February, or she would have to hire help she could not afford, or she would have to leave the homestead she refused to leave. "So I looked for a change," she said simply. "I remembered what I had seen. I remembered what my grandmother had written. I put the two together and I did the work." Otto Bergman was silent for a long time after she finished. He drank his coffee slowly. He watched the small, steady flame in her stove and felt the warmth radiating from the iron, and understood, in a way he had not understood before, that this was not madness at all. This was engineering. This was a woman who had reasoned her way through a problem that her neighbors had accepted as inevitable, and she had solved it. The blizzard came on the 4th of January, 1887, and it came with a violence that even Silas Kettleman, who had seen 40 winters in the Northern Territories, would later describe as the worst he had ever witnessed. It began just after midnight with a sudden drop in temperature that woke half the settlement, a plummet so severe that the wooden joints of houses cracked audibly in the darkness. By dawn, the mercury in Cassius Merriweather's parlor thermometer, the only instrument in Redstone Crossing calibrated below zero, had fallen to negative 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the wind began. It came out of the northwest at a sustained speed that later observers estimated at 60 miles per hour, with gusts that reached 70 or more. The snow that had accumulated across December, some 18 inches on the open prairie, lifted into the air and became a horizontal wall of driven ice. Visibility fell to less than 3 feet. A man standing at his own doorway could not see his own barn 50 feet away. Cattle froze standing upright in their pens, their eyes glazing over before they had time to lie down. Horses in unheated stables developed frostbite on their nostrils and eyelids within an hour. And the settlement of Redstone Crossing, which had never faced anything approaching this severity, discovered within the first 6 hours of the storm that its collective preparations had been inadequate. Cassius Merriweather's stove, which he had been feeding continuously since the temperature had begun to drop the previous evening, could not keep his mercantile above 40 degrees. He and his wife retreated to their bedroom in the rear of the building, closed every door between themselves and the store, and huddled together under a mound of quilts as the wind found gap after gap in their walls. By noon of the 4th, Cassius had burned through nearly a third of the reserve wood he had estimated would last him a month. Percival Tate, the young dry goods clerk who had wagered his leather boots that Elspeth Wren's cabin would burn, was staying with his uncle in a small house on the edge of the settlement. That house lost the sod covering off half its roof within the first 3 hours of the storm, and Percival spent the day, and the following night crouched in a corner with 3 blankets around his shoulders, and no ability to reach the woodshed because the drifting snow had sealed the door. Otto Bergman, whose Bavarian discipline had led him to prepare more thoroughly than most, held his own reasonably well for the first day. But by the second morning, the drifting snow had piled against the north side of his house to a depth of 9 feet, and although this drift was inadvertently insulating that wall, It had also blocked his chimney draft. Smoke began to back up into his kitchen, and he was forced to let his stove burn low or risk suffocating his family. The interior temperature of his house fell from a tolerable 52 degrees to a dangerous 38 within 4 hours. The Reverend and his wife, at the parsonage in the center of town, gathered 6 of their neighbors into their front room in a desperate consolidation of body heat and firewood. 14 people slept on that parlor floor the second night of the blizzard, and even so, the ice formed on the inside of their windows in patterns so thick that morning light could not penetrate them. By the third day, the storm had not abated, and Redstone Crossing was in genuine crisis. 3 families had abandoned their homes for other, better-heated houses. 2 elderly widowers, both of whom had lived alone, were being desperately sought by their neighbors and could not be reached because the drifts between houses had become impassable. Cassius Merriweather had begun rationing his wood in a way that meant his mercantile now sat at 34 degrees, and he had accepted that if the storm did not break within another day, he and his wife would have to attempt the dangerous journey to a neighbor's house. And out at the Wren homestead, 4 miles from the settlement, entirely cut off from human contact for the duration of the storm, Elspeth Wren was reading a book of her grandmother's letters by the light of an oil lamp, wearing a plain woolen dress and no shawl, while her cast-iron stove burned 4 pieces of split oak at a slow and steady rate that had not varied significantly since the storm began. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th of January, 3 full days after it had begun. The wind died gradually across the night, and by dawn the sky had cleared to a hard blue emptiness that seemed almost obscene after the endless white violence of the preceding days. The temperature remained brutal -32 at sunrise, but the air was still, and stillness meant survival. Redstone Crossing emerged from its shelters slowly and in shock. The 2 elderly widowers had both been found alive, one huddled in his root cellar with his dogs, the other in a hayloft where he had climbed to be closer to the trapped warmth of his few remaining cattle. Both would recover, though the older man would lose 2 toes and part of 1 ear to frostbite. 9 head of cattle had died across the settlement, along with 3 horses and an uncountable number of chickens. Half a dozen roofs had suffered significant damage. Cassius Merriweather's mercantile had lost its front window entirely, blown inward by a gust on the second night, and the interior of the store was filled with 2 feet of packed snow that had drifted across his goods. But every human being in Redstone Crossing had survived. Barely, and at tremendous cost in fuel and comfort and terror, but they had survived. And once the immediate work of digging out and accounting for the living was underway, the collective mind of the settlement turned, almost as one, to the same question. What had happened at the Wren homestead? Otto Bergman was the first to set out. He hitched his one surviving horse to a small sled and broke a trail west across the drifted prairie, following the memory of the road rather than any visible sign of it. Behind him, on foot and on horseback, came Reverend Hollies, Silas Kettleman riding double behind a younger man, Percival Tate wearing every garment he owned, and Cassius Merriweather himself, whose curiosity had finally overcome his pride. 6 men in total made the 4-mile journey that morning, and it took them nearly 3 hours to cover the distance. What they found when they crested the low rise a quarter mile from Elspeth Wren's homestead stopped them all in their tracks. From the top of the rise, the cabin should have been visible as a small dark shape against the white. It was not. The blizzard had done to Elspeth's cabin what it had done to every other structure on the prairie, only more so. The drifting snow had piled against her wood-walled fortress until the entire structure had disappeared beneath a smooth white mound that rose gently from the ground and peaked at what must have been 15 or 16 feet. Only 2 features broke the surface. The black iron chimney, from which a thin, steady wisp of pale smoke rose straight into the still cold air, and the very tip of her cabin's roof peak, visible as a dark triangle against the whiteness. "Mein Gott," Otto Bergman whispered. They approached carefully. The snow around the mound was 10 feet deep in places, sculpted by the wind into curves that resembled ocean waves frozen mid-crest. It took the men nearly an hour of shoveling to reach the vestibule door, and when Otto finally cleared the last drift and knocked on the outer boards, there was a pause, then footsteps, then the sound of a latch lifting. Elspeth Wren opened the door wearing a woolen dress and stockings, her hair pinned neatly, her face showing mild surprise but no distress whatsoever. She looked past Otto at the assembled crowd of 6 men, several of whom were still leaning on shovels and breathing hard, and she raised her eyebrows slightly. "Gentlemen," she said, "I did not expect visitors so early after the storm. Please come in. I have coffee and I can offer you bread, though I have not baked in 3 days because I did not wish to open the stove." They filed in one at a time through the vestibule, stamping snow from their boots and removing hats and mittens. And one at a time, each of them stepped through the inner door into Elspeth's main room and stopped, exactly as Otto Bergman had stopped 6 weeks earlier, halted in mid-stride by the shocking, uncomplicated warmth of the space. Reverend Hollis removed his heavy coat before he had taken 3 steps. Cassius Merriweather stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open. Silas Kettleman began to laugh, a low, wheezing chuckle that grew into a full-throated cackle of vindication. Cassius Merriweather was the first to speak, and to his credit, he did not attempt to save his own dignity. He removed his hat, held it against his chest, and looked at Elspeth Wren with an expression of complete and undisguised humility. "Mrs. Wren," he said, "I have been a fool. I have said things about you in my store that I will spend the rest of my life regretting. I ask your forgiveness, and I ask you to teach me what you know." Elspeth studied him for a long moment. She was not a woman who took pleasure in the humbling of others, but she was also not a woman who pretended offenses had not occurred. Finally, she inclined her head slightly. "Sit down, Mr. Merriweather. Sit down, all of you. I will make coffee and we will talk about wood." They stayed for the better part of the day. Silas Kettleman, in particular, could not stop grinning, and he made a point of accepting a second cup of coffee, just so he could continue sitting in the warmth of the room and watching the other men absorb what they were seeing. Reverend Hollis walked slowly around the interior of the cabin, running his hand along the walls, feeling the difference between the temperature of the interior logs and what he knew the temperature of the exterior air must be. Otto Bergman sat quietly beside the stove and asked the practical questions of a man who intended to replicate the technique himself. Elspeth explained the principle patiently. She spoke of trapped air and its insulating properties. She spoke of the wind and how her wood walls broke its force before it ever reached her cabin's actual logs. She spoke of the snow that had drifted against her woodpile and how it had become a second layer of insulation, working with the wood rather than against it. She spoke of her stove's central position and her sealed vestibule and her thick window curtains. She spoke of everything, hiding nothing, because Thomas had always said that knowledge kept to oneself was knowledge that died, and knowledge shared was knowledge that lived. By spring, 7 households in Redstone Crossing had stacked firewood against their exterior walls in preparation for the following winter. By the winter of 1888, the number had grown to 15, and travelers passing through the settlement began to remark on the peculiar appearance of the town, where nearly every cabin sat inside a fortress of split cordwood. A newspaperman from Bismarck rode out in the autumn of 1889 to write a small piece on the practice, which he called the Wren method, and his article was reprinted in a handful of agricultural journals across the northern plains. Elspeth Wren lived on her homestead for another 23 years. She never remarried, though she was courted twice, gently and unsuccessfully. She became something of a local institution in the years that followed, consulted by new arrivals about winter preparations, and asked, occasionally, to lecture at the small schoolhouse on practical matters of homesteading. She never charged for her advice, and she never claimed credit for a technique she insisted her Welsh grandmother had known long before her. When she died in the winter of 1910, at the age of 68, her cabin was still standing, still surrounded each autumn by its ring of stacked firewood, still sheltering the family who had purchased it from her estate. The story reaches across the century and a half between her time and ours with a lesson that has not aged. Elspeth Wren was mocked because she did something her neighbors could not understand, and she was mocked most cruelly by the ones who considered themselves most educated. She was defended, quietly and stubbornly, by an old trapper who had seen enough winters to know that survival wisdom rarely announced itself with credentials. And she was vindicated not by argument but by the simple, indifferent test of a Dakota blizzard, which cared nothing for opinions and everything for physics. There are Elspeth Wrens in every generation. There are quiet, competent people who have thought carefully about problems the rest of us have accepted as inevitable, and who have arrived at solutions we cannot at first understand. The habit of listening to them, of extending them the benefit of the doubt, of choosing curiosity over ridicule when we encounter something we do not immediately grasp, is not merely good manners. In a hard enough winter, it is survival. If this story of forgotten wisdom moved you, please give this video a like. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of unlikely mastery, and leave a comment telling me about a traditional skill you believe the modern world has been foolish to forget.